It's December 16th, 2011. I'm Robert M. Price, the Bible Geek. Today I want to do something very different than the usual format of the show. I'm sure you have heard, I hope I'm not the first one to give you the news of the tragic death of one of our heroes, Christopher Hitchens. He was fascinating, eloquent speaker and writer. Though, what's the point of saying that? Anybody that's ever heard of him knows this is true. I want to read you a story of mine that is sort of a tribute to him. I sent it by way of Tom Flynn to Christopher Hitchens to read, since he figures into it, but I not surprisingly, never heard anything from him. He had more urgent matters to deal with. This is a story that will be appearing in a collection called What Scares the Boogeyman. And if you have read H.P. Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu, this will have an added dimension. But even if you haven't, I think it'll make plenty of sense, and I would like to read it today as a tribute to the great Christopher Hitchens. The Fear of the Lord. 1. The Secret in Sandstone. I deem it the most pathetic thing in the world when we cannot correlate what our minds tell us must be true with what we would prefer to believe. Readers are not unlikely to know me as a skeptical and often political essayist and literary critic. Most of my books and essay collections deal with great literature and political matters, though a couple have cast down the gauntlet to challenge religion. I held a child's belief in God, heaven, and the church until university years, whereupon wider reading disabused me of my fairy tales and illusions. Having experienced this enlightenment, a simple matter, or so I judged, I was impatient to see other students, equally sharp, who nonetheless held on to their puerile religious convictions. The more they learned, it seemed, the more desperate, and I suspected disingenuous they became in order to retain their faith, or the desperate pretense of holding it. Their arguments, for we used often to debate the matter, were so contrived that I suspected they were trying to suppress their own doubts and to convince themselves by rationalizing. Eventually I wearied of such sport, and after graduate studies I set out on the literary career of which I have spoken. It was only a few years ago that I entered the ring again. The upsurge of religious obscurantism, as well as the flood of violence committed in God's name, moved me to begin writing on religion and its bluffing. This seemed to me, in fact, a moral obligation, for I felt someone had to point out that a philosophy of life based unstably upon an initial piece of self-deceit must sooner or later manifest the unscrupulousness at the heart of its zealotry. I did not believe that the Christian religion possessed the credentials its defenders affirmed it had. Eyewitness testimony in the Gospels, pagan attestation of a historical Jesus, and so forth, these supposed data being matters of hot dispute even among Christians themselves. My principal objections were more in the philosophical and ethical vein. The gross arbitrariness of the doctrine of the atoning death of Christ, for instance. How could anyone possibly think it just for an innocent man to take on himself the punishment due a race of wicked offenders? Again, what sense can it make to claim that the world with all its horrors is supervised by watchful, loving, omnipotent deities? One can defend such a deity only by redefining all these attributes away to nothing. And then what claim is being made? Not to forget the hell of eternal torment. What could account for a prescient deity creating a human race, most of whom he knew would be headed for everlasting torment? But I suppose the Christian tenet most repugnant to me was the outrage of demanding the sacrifice of individual moral autonomy. How degrading of human dignity! If this religion, or pretty much any other, is true, then the world is a tyranny, or worse, a madhouse. Religious believers of the more intellectual type, reminiscent of my debate partners in college, began to reply to my critiques in print and finally to challenge me to to challenge me to platform debates, some of them on public television. I actually debated a few opponents more than once, like a traveling road show, which held no surprises for us on stage, but which tickled the curiosity of our large audiences. It was through this futile but enjoyable debating that I made a new friend, one Jermaine Calkins, a deservedly famous geneticist who had been instrumental in unlocking the code of DNA. He was, as it happened, a doctrinaire fundamentalist. One could not but suspect that his biblicist followers took vicarious pride in his scientific attainments, and that he seemed living proof that one need not sacrifice the intellect to serve Christ. But then he never really ventured to bring his scientific expertise to bear in debate, for how could he? He did not even claim that scientific research had led him to faith. In fact, he had been convinced by certain historical arguments for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which I thought held no water. He was, in my judgment, a Christian in spite of his great mind, not because of it. But he was a jolly and great-hearted man, and I could not help but like him. It did not even offend me when he promised he would pray for me. I knew he meant well, and I recalled a quip from Bob Harrington, the comedic chaplain of Bourbon Street, who used to cover the debate circle some decades ago, facing off against atheist matriarch Madeline Murray O'Hare. Once, he said, a pious old lady who thought him too frivolous told him scoldingly that she would be praying for him, to which he replied, "That's fine, ma'am. I probably need the prayer, and you probably need the practice." My friend Jermaine returned a good laugh when I tried the comeback on him. A good fellow. Obviously, we had tacitly agreed to disagree, but this did not stop him from occasionally making tactful observations and reading suggestions that he hoped might lead me to embrace faith. Accordingly, one day he enthusiastically handed me a journal article claiming that a collector in Jerusalem had purchased from a dealer of antiquities a remarkable ancient ossuary. An ossuary was a bone box. Jews in the early centuries of the Common Era often waited for the bones of their entombed dead to slough off their flesh, and then would gather the bones into a stone container about the size and dimensions of a shoebox. This one, the collector claimed, though now empty of all but dry dust, had once housed the sacred bones of James the Just, the brother of Jesus Christ. Actually, what the chiseled inscription said was James the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, the Hebrew equivalent, of course. The scholar argued on the basis of ancient population estimates and the known occurrence of common names in ancient Judea that a man whose name was James, Jacob, being both the son of a man named Joseph and the brother of another named Jesus, virtually had to be the one famous from the Bible. Naturally, as the article admitted, there were scholarly dissenters, but the reasoning seemed pretty sound, at least to Jermaine. I was suspicious. Why was this not merely intriguing, but rather important? If the ossuary had been identified correctly, it meant that the long-standing debate over whether Jesus of Nazareth had been a real historical figure or only a mythic hero like Osiris and Hercules was put to rest. The most radical of skeptics would thus have been soundly refuted. As for myself, I did not have a dog in this particular race. It did not matter much to me, as an unbeliever, whether there had really been a Jesus or not. Some wise sayings had been attributed to him, nor would I deny that. But the notion of his possibly having been the Son of God was a non-starter, if one believed, as I did, that there was no God to begin with. But Jermaine seemed to regard the discovery as a blow struck for his side and fairly gloated over it, as did many scholars of religion who were, alas, soon to be eating their words, just like those who scant years before had been fooled by the hoax of the so-called Hitler diaries. Serious objections to the James identification soon emerged. For one thing, it seemed that brother of Jesus had been scrawled by a different hand than that which had carved son of Joseph. This meant there was no particular reason to believe the former was part of the original inscription at all. For another, the patina, the film of ancient dust and oil covering the sandstone box, stopped at the edge of the incised letters. Obviously, this meant the letters had one and all been carved into an old box in recent days. And then the Israeli Antiquities Authority, in a scene right out of The Untouchables, raided the home of the collector who claimed to have purchased the ossuary from a dealer. It turned out he had a miniature factory in the back room where he turned out fake relics to sell to scholarly suckers. This is why a supposed archaeological find doesn't mean much, or shouldn't, if the owner cannot tell you who found it and where and how it came to its owner. I need not tell you how deflated Germain was, nor did I rub it in. After all, the disqualification of this bit of evidence proved or disproved nothing. Even if it had been genuinely ancient, I thought, it was equivocal at best. But not long afterward, a truly amazing, really uncanny development occurred. This time I did not need Germain to inform me of it. An archaeologist was exploring a site in Egypt which he believed to be the site described by Philo Judaeus, where a monastic community of Jewish ascetics called the Therapeutai had dwelt. He hoped to find concrete evidence that might further illuminate the ancient sect. It had been the object, I now read, of much speculation. Some scholars, such as Christian Lindner, saw in the name a version of that of South Asian Buddhism, the Theravada, or the Way of the Elders. That implied that Jewish monasticism was actually founded by Buddhist missionaries whom King Asoka had dispatched to Syria and Egypt in the 3rd century BCE. Other scholars believe the Therapeutai to be an Egyptian branch of the Essene sect who inhabited the Jordan Valley, among whom most numbered the community of the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. Of course, these theories, though seldom combined, were by no means incompatible. The 4th century church historian Eusebius had taken the Therapeutai, long extinct by his time, to be a band of primitive Christians, and even suggested Philo had visited St. Peter in Rome. The explorer, one must say, hit the jackpot. I forget the rest of his tale, but he did find what he was looking for. While no tantalizing manuscripts came to light, some iconography did suggest Buddhist themes. But the real stunner was, yes, another ossuary, ostensibly containing the bones of James the Just. If this one were genuine, or even if it proved to be an ancient fake rather than a modern one, the implications were major, at least if one were interested in these questions. And given what my debating opponents might seek to make of this find, I had to follow the coverage as best I could. At one stroke, all the hitherto competing theories were vindicated and merged. The Therapeutai must indeed have been Theravadins as well as Essenes, with whom James had sometimes been associated. And if James had been one of these Buddhist Essene therapeutes, could Jesus Christ have been far behind? As the weeks went by, carbon-14 dating, paleography, and tests of the telltale patina all checked out, and a closer examination of the inscription revealed a clear reference to Jesus, King Messiah. There was no doubt this was the final resting place of James, son of Mary and Joseph, brother of Jesus, who had therefore really existed as more than a myth. My friend Germain was, on one level, quite thrilled, as if a treasured possession once lost had been restored to him, and on this I congratulated him. The connection with Buddhism, however, was not much to his liking, offending his orthodox beliefs about Christian origins and his dismissal of all non-Christian faiths as simply false. I had to smile, hoping the unexpected revelation might push him toward a more tolerant stance. Little did I then suspect in what direction the discovery might begin to push me, however incrementally. 2. The Tale of Inspector Legrand. A few months later, I chanced to catch a program on what once deserved the name the History Channel, but which had, like its kindred networks, Arts and Entertainment and Bravo, abandoned their original missions and sunk to the level of cheap sensationalism. I had clicked the button on the remote control as quickly as I could, and more than once recently, to escape the ludicrous spectacles such as the quack exorcist and anti-rock and roll crusader Bob Larson telling tall tales of the demons he personally had cast out, and which rock songs each devil had penned. But this evening the interviewee was a sober-seeming police detective from New Orleans, famous for his crackdown on organized crime in the Big Easy some years before Hurricane Katrina. I was surprised to see him subjecting himself to participation in such a sideshow, but soon I realized that no more respectable venue would have risked hosting him. The inspector was recounting a raid on some out-of-the-way crack houses in the Bayou country. He and his men were taken by surprise, to put it mildly, when they came upon, deep in the swamp, the lowlifes they had sought, and they were engaging in what looked to be a religious ritual. Religious devotion to anything but drugs was not exactly what one expected from denizens like these, so the police hunkered down in the reeds, which provided more than ample covering, while they watched the event unfold. Legrand, of Haitian ancestry himself, recognized some elements of the ritual from voodoo and obeah ceremonies witnessed as a boy. But whereas voodoo was a syncretic mix of African traditional religion and Catholic slave religion, what he was now observing was decidedly more sinister. He thought he heard chanting invocations of Satan, Mastema, Semyaza, all names for the Christian devil, but these were by no means the harmless posers familiar from American pop Satanism, the make-believe cults of LaVey and his merry pranksters. When Legrand saw a sudden eruption of blood amidst the general chaos of leaping and diving naked bodies, he decided he must act. It might be an animal sacrifice, but it might be the blood of a human captive. He could not see which from his present vantage point. He had risen halfway from his crouch when what he beheld froze him where he was. Above the howling pack of degenerates there towered a form of fiery golden radiance. It had angelic eagle wings and the head of a goat. It was both beautiful and horrible, and it could not be some special effects projection. Not here, not in these circumstances, not with these idiots. But now they had been seen. Though most of the cultists were focused on the rising apparition, some few men must have been posted as watchers. At the sight of Legrand and his men, they shouted to one another and opened fire with the weapons they already had poised. This broke the spell. The image vanished with a blazing flash which set several of the thickly crowding trees. Swampy conditions, the fire did not burn out of control and even died down quickly, but it had achieved two results. The ensuing melee provided sufficient confusion for the revelers to escape, no doubt along secret paths known only to them. And the blackened branches and scorched trunks proved it was no hallucination that the inspector and most of his men agreed they had seen. Legrand, a man of stolid character, did his duty and reported precisely what he had seen. Not surprisingly, his superiors rejected his report and fired him, along with a couple of his men who dared to come forth and corroborate his wild story. Apparently, Legrand had supplied enough entertainment for the jaded audience, and the host summarily dismissed him with an insincere, "Thanks for being with us." But I, for one, had to hear more. At once I got up and retrieved my calendar book to see when I might be able to book a flight to Louisiana, for I felt I had to talk to this man. Maybe he was a fanatic or a lunatic, but he certainly hadn't seemed like one, and he had made a far more convincing case for the reality of the supernatural than Jermaine Calkins or his fellow apologists ever had. I was curiously disturbed by what this humble and sober-seeming man had said. I still cannot say why I did not simply dismiss it as if it were one more UFO abduction story from a gap-toothed hillbilly. I suppose my intellectual conscience was reminding me that that would have been unfair of me, that I would have been excluding evidence for that which I disliked to believe. At any rate, the bee was in my bonnet now, and there was but one way to get it out. I had to track down Inspector Legrand. The next day I contacted the show's producer through the History Channel website, phoning once I had the number. They usually shielded their guests from contact with pesky viewers, but I managed to convince them to put me in touch with Legrand, or at least to supply contact information. You see, they recognized my name and my voice from my own several media appearances. I make a point not to exploit my notoriety, since I hate when others do it, but sometimes it comes in handy. By sunset, I had reached Legrand and persuaded him to see me. He had plenty of time, given his forced early retirement. I felt I had to see the man in person to properly assess his own belief in his story and the likelihood that he had not unwittingly embellished it, as often happens when someone witnesses an odd event. 3 days later, the inspector, as polite a fellow as ever I had met, picked me up from the airport and drove us in his aging Buick to one of his favorite restaurants. It was nothing fancy, but they didn't mind you lingering for a long conversation. As I sat across from him and absently munched whatever it was I had ordered, I was struck not only with the man's acuity, but with his look of profound weariness and resignation. He did not so much mourn the loss of his job and his chosen work, as he seemed utterly at a loss to assimilate his recent experience. I now had no doubt that he was not magnifying his story. If anything, the opposite was true. He several times hedged, suggesting that perhaps this or that detail was not quite as it seemed. But I could see he simply could not bring himself to dismiss his encounter as an illusion. If he wasn't going to lie to anyone else about it, he sure was not about to start lying to himself. In fact, there had been more to the incident than he had dared to disclose, even on TV. He had feared incarceration as a lunatic. What he had not divulged, as he now told me, was that the looming, luminous figure of Baphomet grabbed up several both of the rioting cultists and of his own men, whereupon they blazed like flares in his scaly hands, and then he popped them into his open maw like blackened marshmallows. This fact helped explain his abrupt dismissal from the police department, since he could not account for the disappearance of these officers in any believable way. As I sat there and listened to Inspector Legrand, I found myself feeling that his crazy story was yet somehow plausible, given the evidence he had provided, the burning and charring in the swamp, which I verified for myself the same afternoon, and the testimony of his surviving men, which had cost them so much. But I also felt a foreboding sense that, should I dare entertain the possible truth of his story, I should be embarking on a road I did not want to go down, to a destination I very much feared. I thanked the inspector and commiserated with him on his treatment, and I returned home, all the while feeling I had been cut loose from any familiar moorings. The next week, I decided to meet with Germain. I needed to know what he would make of the story. I knew pretty well, without asking, what my secular colleagues would say. At least Germain had a wider frame of reference. I called him up and arranged to meet him for dinner the next evening. "Well, Chris," he said, "I guess you can see the implications here. If there is a devil, and I get the impression you're open to that possibility, then there must be a God, too, right?" The thought had crossed my mind, but I was not about to give up without a fight. "Actually, I don't think you get the implications, my friend. If there is an arch-fiend who can counter God's moves, thwart his will, successfully defy him, What kind of God are we talking about? I mean, I guess I could almost see Spinoza's God or Tillich's, more of an impersonal essence or something. But if there's a goat hoof devil and he's God's opposite number, well, wouldn't even you agree that's raw mythology? He was quick with a reply. I confess I never paid much attention to the Satan business. I figure man's own evil is enough to explain most of what happens in the world, but there is the Bible, and there's what Legrand says he saw. Maybe things are a bit more like we learned them in childhood. Maybe we've made it too abstract. I don't know. But one thing does occur to me. If you try very hard, you could probably come up with some rationalization of this thing, but I'm willing to bet it would be like your friend Hume said. You shouldn't believe any report of a miracle until any rival explanation would itself be more far-fetched than the miracle itself. I had already decided I was not going to try to get out of a tight spot by using the kind of tortured reasoning fundamentalists use when they're trying to avoid admitting a biblical contradiction. I was getting a headache. 3. The Witness from the Sea. I must admit I tried to put the whole crazy business out of my mind for the next weeks, but it was not to last. I was up late working on a column about the latest Mideast war when the phone rang. On the other end was a fellow skeptic who insisted I go to the television and turn on the Catholic channel. I knew which one he meant. Sometimes trying to escape Pat Robertson's squinting smiles, I would hasten up a few clicks and find myself flinching at Mother Angelica, the head honcho of the network. She always looked like the witch from Hansel and Gretel, if you asked me. But here was the channel, and some gray-robed monk was blathering on about the mercies of the Mother of God, the Blessed Mother of our Savior. So what, I thought, but I decided I'd best listen to a little of it, if only to understand the jokes my friend would be making about it next time I saw him. Suddenly I could see what my pal had thought so funny, at least outrageous. The monk wasn't talking about the same old apparitions of the Blessed Virgin at Fatima and La Salette, but of something from a decade ago that had come to light only recently. A Norwegian sea captain had been about to go down with his ship in a terrible typhoon that had blown up out of nowhere, and he'd had a vision too. Like Legrand's, it had been a whopper. This time a nimbus of light had formed, the story went, above the ship, cutting through the gray shroud of the driving rain. It formed an oval, and within it there appeared a three-dimensional image of the Virgin Mary. She said in a ringing voice, loud enough to be heard above the storm, "Peace, be still," and the wind and rain stopped almost immediately, like bad editing in a movie. I figured it was a lot of pious nonsense. Who knew what had happened, if anything at all? But then 2 details made my ears perk up. 1, all the sailors, like most Scandinavians, were Protestants, not likely to have visions or even tell tales of the Virgin Mary. 2, the captain, a man named Josephson, did not at the time understand what the voice had uttered, though he said he remembered exactly what it sounded like. When he got back to Oslo, he went to inquire of a linguist at the university, who told him the meaning of the words he had heard in Aramaic. You know what they say, in for a penny, in for a pound. I started making travel plans again. Online, I was able to dig up a couple of old and skimpy reports, one in a pretty derisive tone about Captain Josephson's Mariological adventure. I already knew he had been located in Oslo, and these internet clips gave me a couple of new clues. I figured I'd probably be able to nail down a definite address once I got there, perhaps from the local police. On the long flight over, I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep, so I bought a couple of books Germaine had loaned me, Mere Christianity by the Venerable C.S. Lewis and The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. I had always inclined toward regarding Lewis as too clever for his own good, and Chesterton as a pompous windbag with nothing cogent to say. But in light of recent experiences, I thought it might be worth reading them through again with new eyes. But I found only my usual objections to faith coming to mind again and again, almost on every page. How could a fair-minded God condemn you to hell for flunking a theology exam, not having the right beliefs? And how can poor mortals ever decide which of the competing sects has the right beliefs? How can reasoning adults be told just to put their own judgment on the shelf and believe what an old book says simply because the old book says it? I kept shaking my head and finally closed the books. Sleep came after all. In Oslo, I went through customs and checked into my hotel. I didn't bother with the police after all, but visited the American embassy, and they were able to give me what I needed after 2 or 3 calls. Nice people. So I hailed a cab and handed the driver the paper slip with Josephson's address hastily penciled on it. It didn't take long till he deposited me on the curb in front of a tidy old cottage that bore the name Josephson on its freestanding mailbox. Up the slate walk I went, then knocked. After a few moments, the door opened a crack, and an eye scrutinized me from behind a thick lens. I thought it was a woman's eye. "Mrs. Josephson?" I pulled from my pocket one of those cell phones with the translation program. I thought I might as well try this first and go off to find a translator if I had to. I gave her my name and asked briefly if I might talk to her husband. I could understand enough of what she said in answer to know I had come much too late. Her husband, the captain, had died of a stroke some years earlier. Luckily, she knew a bit of English, enough to tell me the bad news. I managed to convey that I was very interested in his vision of Mary. She motioned me to wait a moment, then returned with a video cassette. I gathered it was a recording of her late husband telling his story for the umpteenth time. He must have decided to tell it on tape and be done with it, just hand it to future inquirers. I imagined there had been a lot of them. But why a video cassette rather than just an audio cassette? I thanked her and left her, I hope, in peace. Back in my hotel room, I ordered up a VCR and put the cassette in its mouth. I expected to see an old man sitting in his easy chair rattling off a tall tale, and I thought it would probably be all in Norwegian. Surely I would have to get someone to make me a transcript in English. But no, definitely not. My scalp tingled. My arms went numb. I felt lightheaded. One of Josephson's crewmen had brought along a video camera for any one of a number of possible reasons. He had caught the apparition on tape. Given the conditions, the camera work was pretty choppy, as you'd expect. But remember, the violence of the storm had abated suddenly, and the man was able to hold the camera pretty steady for long enough to catch the image of the giant woman up in the sky. I suppose it was possible for the tape to have been an elaborate hoax like that alien autopsy thing, but I cannot easily picture these old, poor, salt-of-the-earth peasants having the skill or taking the trouble. Again, that seemed about as unlikely as the truth of what I had seen on the tape, and I saw it several times. I still have it. All during the trip home, the flight attendants kept asking me if I was sick. Not exactly sick, no, but I spent the whole flight in a state of near shock. I felt utterly at sea, as if my sanity were slipping away. Of course, once I got home, I showed the tape to various experts who all assumed it was, if not a hoax, a cinematic fiction, but none of them could find any trace of artifice. Whoever had shot it, all averred, was an unknown master whose skills none of these professionals could match. That's all I needed to hear. By the way, there was an email waiting for me on my computer from the New Orleans police. Inspector Legrand had been burned to death in his apartment, though nothing around the body was so much as singed. You know, like those cases they chalk up to spontaneous human combustion. Come to think of it, I believe I first heard about that on the History Channel, too. 4 Angel Street. I didn't sleep for a few days, and then I slept for a few days. My head was spinning, my world was tottering. Maybe I should have phoned Germain, but I didn't. I guess I was afraid he might gloat, but of course he wouldn't. I guess I was too proud to admit I might have been wrong about everything all this time. I still can't stand the idea. But I don't think it's pride. I've always been able to change my mind if somebody could prove me wrong. I've actually done it a couple of times, though never on anything this big. I decided I needed a rest, so I took off for the mountains after canceling a couple of major speaking engagements. I tried to put everything out of mind. Drinking helped, but not for very long. I located a Bible and glanced through the Gospels, then the Epistle to the Romans. None of it seemed very plausible to me, either the stories or the reasoning. I guess it might have been possible to admit the reality of the supernatural without having to swallow all this stuff, but then I thought of how the James ossuary, the visitation of Satan, the apparition of Mary, all of it was very specifically Christian, even Catholic. But how could it be true? And even worse, what if it was? What would my life mean? What kind of a universe would I be stuck in? But the vice was about to get squeezed tighter. I was hiking through the hills one evening again, trying to get my mind back in its usual groove, trying to plan out a new essay, maybe a new book, one on politics maybe. Nothing was coming, and night was rapidly falling. I stopped and built a campfire. I opened a can of beans. I dropped it whole into the fire as my fingers went nerveless. Above me there appeared in a shower of light the form of a winged man. Yes, I might as well say it, an angel. He looked straight at me, and he said in tones that chimed like a bell, "Chris, you have been greatly blessed. It is time for you to stop running, to give your heart to our Father and His Son. Will you do it?" And he held out his hand to me. Where another might rejoice at such a token of divine favor, I cannot rise from the slough of despond. Despite the light that nearly blinded me, I am mired in a darkness of soul, for I now know I do have a soul. I can no longer deny that Germain and his friends are horribly correct, only they are fools not to see the leaden weight of the thing. There is a capricious Jehovah who crushes the innocent to save the guilty, and who nonetheless shovels his children into hell like coal into a furnace. There is a Trinity which we cannot understand, but must try our best to believe in on pain of damnation. We must bow and scrape and kowtow to a tyrant who demands unceasing flattery and blind obedience. We live in a cosmic insane asylum with the patients in charge. Under the burden of this knowledge, I must try to live out my days. And after that, will I be condemned for not doing what I cannot do, accepting a faith which every moral instinct bids me disdain? I cannot lose my soul in a bid to save it. I shall know soon enough. I have just been diagnosed with inoperable cancer. I'll see you next time on the Bible Geek.